Welcoming you all. So thank you so much for joining us tonight for this online meeting. My name's Shelley Asquith. I'm co-chair of the Stop the War Coalition. I know lots of you, speakers included, are engaged in mobilizations responding to Israel's slaughter of Palestinians in Gaza and the calls for a ceasefire, including some of our speakers actually tonight are involved in meetings with police and preparing for this weekend's events. But we are, despite what some say at the moment, a coalition with a number of causes and targets. And we are here tonight to talk about the 8-year-long Saudi-led war on Yemen, its consequences, and our campaigns around it. It's estimated that more than 370,000 people have died as a result of the war on Yemen, 150,000 directly from fighting the bombing campaign, including more than 11,000 children. And the desperate conditions of those who survive mean this is widely regarded as the world's worst humanitarian crisis, where 11 million children are in need of some kind of basic assistance, including water, food, and sanitation. And where people die, if not from bombs or starvation, then in a human crush to get the food that they can from aid agencies. This has been a priority for us as Stop the War Coalition, an organisation that aims our fire at our own government here in Britain, because Britain has been backing and arming Saudi Arabia right from the start, and today is the primary supplier of weapons to the regime. We've held meetings and protests throughout this period. In the past, we've heard from Yemenis in Britain, from journalists who've uncovered Britain's secretive supply of weapons, from conscientious objectors in the British Army who've resigned their posts in protest over Britain's role in Yemen. But we come together tonight in particular because we know that the British government is planning to host Mohammed bin Salman, Saudi Crown Prince, in a matter of weeks. We don't know the date yet, but we are going to be mobilising against it when it happens, right here in London, rolling out the red carpet for a war criminal and no doubt shaking blood-stained hands as they sign yet more arms deals. This visit is likely to further cement British government involvement in the war in Yemen, as well as more repression in Saudi Arabia and Bahrain and further imperialist actions in the region. And so I'm pleased that tonight we're joined by a really expert panel of speakers who will help sharpen our understanding of events and issues and re-emphasise for us why we have to continue campaigning against British foreign policy in the Gulf. I'd like to hand over to our first speaker tonight, who is a fellow of the British Academy and a visiting professor at the London School of Economics. She's author and editor of a number of books and founding member of the National Assembly Party, Saudi Opposition Party. Please welcome Madawi Al Rasheed. And Madawi, I think I need to unmute you. You've been invited to be unmuted there.
Yeah. Thank you, Shelley. It's a pleasure to join you in this important meeting, which is timely. Obviously, the region is actually in a crisis at the moment, and I mean the Middle East in general, and specifically the Arab world. Saudi Arabia is central to that Arab world, but unfortunately, it has not played the role that is expected of it. And as you described, the almost 8-year war in Yemen had been one of the problematic military engagement that the Saudi Crown Prince inaugurated his leadership. It started in 2015, just as King Salman, his father, became king. He was a minister of defense, the crown prince at the time, and then he was promoted to become the crown prince later. But I think the focus today is going to be on Saudi Arabia and Britain, and the way that that Britain empowers the regime in Riyadh and allows the regime to actually launch this war in Yemen. But at the same time, we are in the middle of a crisis, and that is Gaza. And unfortunately, the British government has taken the same position that it had taken in the war of Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, and it went it offered full support for Israel in this ongoing war. One thing that is striking about the Saudi British relationship is, as you know, it is one of the first foreign relations that Saudi Arabia had. In fact, if we go back in history, the Saudi regime was a creation of the British, although there were local factors that helped establish the Saudi state. But from early in the 20th century, Saudi Arabia was almost a satellite state under the patronage of Britain until the Second World War, when the United States displaced Britain and started becoming the focus of Saudi foreign guarantee of the crown. And there are certain issues that one has to look at when we're talking about Britain and Saudi Arabia. The argument in London has always been that these regimes, primarily Saudi Arabia and the others like Egypt and the Gulf states, are forces for stability in the region, and therefore they have to be supported, they have to be empowered through the sale of arms, through the transfer of technology and knowledge in general. But we have seen that this specific regime, the Saudi regime, has not been a source of stability in the region or in the world. So first of all, Saudi Arabia was the biggest sponsor of a radical religious interpretation of Islam that precipitated a global jihadi movement. It started in Riyadh, but also it was exported to multiple locations. So it is very difficult to hold the Saudi regime and the religion of the state as a force of stability in the world. The second thing is we have seen that Saudi intrigues had precipitated a war in Yemen, and it is hardly plausible to say British support to the Saudi regime leads to stability in the region. Yemen had, as you mentioned, the crisis in Yemen, the destruction of the infrastructure, the airstrikes that the Saudi regime was launching for the last 7 years have devastated the country and created enclaves of different armed groups. And Saudi Arabia participated in this war together with the United Arab Emirates and managed to sort of have an international cover and more of a regional consent. So it got Egypt on board, Pakistan, although many countries in the region refused to send their own army to help the Saudi launch this war. So the war had been conducted from the sky with heavy bombs falling on Yemenis in their weddings, in their schools, in the hospitals, very much like what we are witnessing now in Gaza in reality on the ground. And it has created a humanitarian crisis. So the argument that the British government continues to arm the Saudi regime because the Saudi regime is a source of stability in the region doesn't hold. And it's actually a misguided policy. In fact, if we look at the other excuse that the British government offers often when its relationship with Saudi Arabia is scrutinized, it always argues that this relationship is extremely important because the Saudis, through their arms contract, they create jobs in the UK and keep the armament industry going. Yes, perhaps there are around 9,000 jobs that are related directly to what Saudi Arabia expects to have in terms of arms from Britain. But that's not a good excuse. The British government is willing to destroy certain industries in the country, the mines and previous industries, without actually worrying about the jobs that are going to be lost. So why, when we're talking about Saudi Arabia and the arms contract with Saudi Arabia, then the jobs become extremely central to the British government's argument about maintaining this relationship. The other argument is about trade in general. I heard from various diplomats say the argument was that, oh, we are a small country, we need this trade with Saudi Arabia. But it goes against all the pledges that the British government had made about having an ethical or a global ethical policy. I don't want to go into details about how the Saudi regime violates human rights domestically and terrorizes its own population. I think the whole world had seen what the Saudi regime is capable of doing and how far it can go in October 2018, when it organized the murder of a peaceful journalist in the Saudi consulate. So, and even that crime was not a deterrent, was not a signal to the British government that this is a regime that is capable of committing crimes abroad on foreign soil against its own citizens. And, you know, I wouldn't rule out if London one day becomes a platform where the Saudis pursue the opposition to their rule in Britain itself. And this brings the issue of security for the increasing number of exiles and diaspora Saudis who have become part of the fabric of British society, and they are living here in Britain. So they have no extra protection, they have no special status, and the Saudis can actually get away with murder, as they did in Istanbul in 2018, which creates a worrying situation for those people who are living here, who had escaped the terror at home and had made London their home or other parts of Britain. Another argument that is usually put as a justification for this relationship with Saudi Arabia from the British side that we've heard is that we like to engage with these regimes, and it's not good enough to ostracize them. So engagement means that the British government can use the sort of the back streets in order to change the behavior of the regime and make it palatable to the constituency here in Britain. But this engagement has failed utterly in changing the behavior of the Saudi regime. And as I mentioned, this crisis, the human rights crisis in the country, you could always refer to the reports of Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, and Al-Qist, which is a Saudi human rights organization based here in London, to see how inside the country you could be put in prison simply for tweeting a critical comment. And today, I haven't been able to verify a video online which shows the Saudi plainclothes Saudi officers arresting a religious scholar in a mosque who was preaching and talking about the Gaza war. I still don't know if it is authentic, but it is likely that the Saudi government would actually suppress any kind of expression of solidarity with Gaza unless it is under the authority of the regime itself. So recently the king announced that he is starting a social relief project to gather money in order to send it to Gaza. So he's asking society to contribute to this fund. And they are boasting, the regime is boasting that they've reached millions of Saudi riyals in support of Gaza. But if anybody has an independent project or an independent scheme to talk about Gaza, let alone gather money or charitable donations, they will be arrested Until the present day, from the Gaza war in 2008, Khalid al-Umair, who's a Saudi activist, he was arrested and he's still in prison simply because he objected to, he called for solidarity with Gaza. In 2008, and now we are in 2023, he is still in prison. So the British arguments that engagement with the Saudi regime leads to changing the behavior of the Saudi regime doesn't actually work. It has not worked in the past, and I don't see how it's going to work in the future. So basically, there is a general problem, and I think I will finish with that. The general problem is not only Britain, but other Western countries. They have neglected all the signs that led to the 2011 Arab uprising. They put their weight behind dictators and military dictators, for example, in Egypt, or royalty in Saudi Arabia, royalty in Bahrain, royalty in other countries, thinking that those are sources of regional stability. They are sources of support in case Britain or any other Western country need them in the future. So basically, this has resulted in serious resentment of Western powers in the region as a whole, because they are seen as on the side of the people who oppress them. In fact, they use the technology that is purchased from the West, whether it's Britain, Italy, the US, France, Germany, etc., to suppress their own people, not to defend the borders of their own of their countries, because the crisis in these countries, including Saudi Arabia, is internal. The fear is from the internal situation of an uprising or dissent, not from an invasion abroad, simply unless you are in Yemen. That's where the danger comes from outside. So they have not, the Western governments have not learned a lesson. Simply because over the last sort of in the post-Second World War order, they continued to support these regimes and justify their crimes and overlook them. And who would have believed in 2018, when a lot of Western government had to make some noises about the atrocity that the Saudi regime committed in Istanbul when they killed the journalist Jamal Khashoggi. So they drew lists of people's names who are denied visa in case they come to Britain. Or they made some noise. But the reality on the ground is business as usual. The armed trade continues, the support continues, the visit continues. Over the last, and they used the excuse of the Russian invasion of the Ukraine in order to, it gave them that kind of excuse that we need oil to stabilize global markets and to deal with the living crisis in Britain. So Sunak goes to Riyadh, and Macron goes to Riyadh, Scholz goes to Riyadh, even Biden goes to Riyadh in order to convince Crown Prince to continue production, increase oil production, which he totally ignored. So basically, we're coming to a situation now where—
Madawi, can I get you to wrap up?
Yes, where the Saudi regime is actually in control of the relationship with Britain and other Western countries, and they can blackmail them and play them against each other. And the argument about arms trade, which really bothers me, is that the British will always say to their audiences that, oh, if we don't sell the Saudis these arms, then the Saudis will, then the French would sell them. So it's basically a competition between different Western countries to sell Saudi Arabia arms for the destruction of other countries, like what happened in Yemen. And thank you. I'm sorry I exceeded the time.
Please don't apologize. That was a really useful overview to get us started. And I do want to come back to this, your suggestion of Saudis beginning to pursue their oppositions here in London, but maybe we'll get into that a little bit more with the later speakers. And to anybody who's joining us, please feel free to post in the chat where you're joining us from, if you're involved in any particular groups or organisations, and if any questions you might have for the speakers that subsequent speakers may be able to touch on. Now, our next speaker is, I think it's lunchtime where she is, actually. It's dinner time where I am, but this is a very international panel tonight. Assistant professor at Michigan State University and a non-resident fellow at the Quincy Institute. She's played a really key role in building opposition to the US, in the US, to the Saudi-led war on her country of birth, Yemen. Really pleased to have you with us, Shireen Al Adayemi. And Shireen, I think I need to just quickly unmute you. Or perhaps I
think you should be able to hear me.
Yes, we can hear you loud and clear. Great, thank you. Hi, Shireen, over to you.
Hi, thank you so much for having me, and thank you, Dr. Al Rasheed, for these incredible remarks. I will keep mine a little bit shorter, so we should still be on time. And thank you, those of you who have joined us today from all over the world. Today, I want to begin by saying that I stand in solidarity with the people of Gaza and Palestine against the brutal genocide against civilians by the Israeli government. I also have to say that over the years, Palestinians have stood in solidarity with the Yemeni cause when honestly few others have. And it's because they understood better than most the reality of living under a crushing blockade and opposition. As a Yemeni American, I continue to be horrified by what my government here in the US has done to ensure the suffering and destruction of Yemen from the very beginning of this war. When Saudi Arabia and the UAE were dropping bombs on Yemeni civilians every single day for 7 years, the US and UK made sure that they trained their pilots, they supplied the bombs, they chose the targets, they repaired their vehicles and their aircrafts, they provided logistical support, and more importantly, they shielded them from any condemnation or accountability at the international level. As Yemenis continue to be killed by airstrikes, our governments continue to cash in on the hundreds of billions of dollars worth of weapons sold to Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates to enable their attacks against Yemeni civilians. But they weren't held accountable by the international community, who either stood silently as they continued to provide support for this war, or joined in and cashed in on the material and diplomatic support to support Yemen's tormentors. And when Saudi Arabia and the UAE imposed an inhumane blockade that prevented the flow of fuel, medicine, food, and even water into Yemen, the US and UK shared crucial intelligence and other information that further enabled them in their genocidal endeavors in Yemen. Today, as a result of direct talks between the Houthis or Ansarullah and the Saudis, Yemenis are no longer subjected to the daily terrors of airstrikes and bombardment. And while those who can afford it are allowed limited opportunities to leave the country, and some fuel shipments are allowed entry to Yemen's ports, the population remains under a Saudi-imposed blockade that reminds us that Yemenis are not free in their own country. They're not free to fish in their own waters. They're not free to export their own natural resources. They're not free to control their own borders, waters, or airspace. The truce that we've seen over the past year has not changed the material lives of Yemenis who continue to suffer from malnutrition and dire economic conditions. Still, the Biden administration denies just the existence of this blockade, even as it claimed the lives of hundreds of thousands of people over the last several years who have starved to death or died from preventable illnesses, and continues to kill a child every 75 seconds. This is the world's worst humanitarian crisis, and it continues to wreak havoc on the lives of ordinary Yemenis. Meanwhile, Saudi Arabia and the UAE-funded puppet appointees are in charge of the so-called liberated areas in the southern Yemen, where about 20% of the population resides and where people are still living under dire health, economic, and security conditions. This too is fully supported by the US and UK governments. Yet the US government continues to deny or minimize its role in fueling Yemeni suffering. When one hears Biden and his officials speaking about the war in Yemen, one would think they were, at worst, concerned bystanders rather than active belligerents in the war. The British and US governments continue to prioritize weapon sales and their geopolitical interests while enabling the starvation and murder of Yemeni civilians, even as they continue to lecture us and the rest of the world about the humanity of Ukrainian civilians and the barbarity of the Russian governments. Despite what they tell us, our governments do not care about human rights or suffering, but they do care about their own power. Until that power is threatened through collective action and activism, nothing is going to change. The images of starving children won't move them to act, nor will statistics showing the impact of airstrikes and the blockade on 30 million people in Yemen. They will only act when we, the people who pay taxes that are rerouted for wars against civilians, and the people who elect these officials with our own votes, take a stand against oppression and use our voting and economic power to enact change. So I want to end by just saying, as we continue to make our collective voices heard against the genocide in Palestine, let's also send our governments a clear message that while they may support oppression in Palestine and in Yemen, we, the people, do not. And thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Shireen. Really great to have you with us and great to hear your voice and sending solidarity from across the Atlantic. Okay, our next speaker is an assistant professor at Michigan, is a professor of Gulf Studies at University of Exeter. I'm reading my notes the wrong way around. An Iranian American, and she was previously professor of Middle East Studies at SOAS. She's another author and editor of a number of books. Really great to be joined by Lala.
Thank you very much for having me. I am also standing in solidarity with Gaza and with Palestinians in general. And in fact, what I'm going to be speaking about today is the normalization of Gulf states' relationship with Israel and what that might mean in terms of organizing around the arrival of Mohammed bin Salman here, but also more broadly and in the longer term. One of the things that is really fascinating for me is the extent to which Palestinian leftists and indeed leftist analysts, including, for example, Fred Halliday in his earlier years, were correct about the relationship between the conservative Arab regimes in the region and the Israeli state. And even long before the normalization of these relationships, the survival of both the conservative Arab states, monarchies and otherwise, and the Israeli state were essentially codependent on one another. In writing a book that I was doing about the infrastructures in the Arabian Peninsula, one of the striking elements, one of the striking articles that I read from the 1960s was that after the 1967 defeat of many Arab states by the Israeli military and the occupation of Sinai, Golan, West Bank, Gaza, and East Jerusalem, both British and American foreign policy experts were writing in various major foreign policy journals, including Foreign Affairs and the Journal of Chatham House, and they were talking about the extent to which the defeat of the Arab states in the 1967 war was a guarantee of survival of those Arab regimes that were allied to the US and Britain at that point. And that has continued to be the case. So we know for a fact that the persistence and the resilience of many of these Arab emirates is not because of any kind of internal legitimacy, but because in many instances they are built on the back of heavily exploited migrant labor and on repression of political dissent and political organization at home. It is really worth noting that for the vast majority of the countries of the Gulf in particular, for example, the rights of assembly, the rights to free speech are circumscribed. Union organization is simply not allowed. The right to collective bargaining does not exist. Not even with partial exceptions of Bahrain and Kuwait, this right does not even exist for citizens. And so I think it is really important to recognize that despite these severe limitations on the internal politics of these places, people actually have used the solidarity with Palestinians as a mode of expressing dissent against their own governments. And this says something to us about the extent to which the Abraham Accords and the potential normalization of relationships between Saudi Arabia under Mohammed bin Salman with Israel is in fact quite unpopular with their citizenry at home. I think that it is really important also to mention the extent to which the relationships between particularly the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, and Saudi Arabia with Israel have long predated the Abraham Accords. For decades now, they have been these countries have been having secret commercial negotiations and have been receiving, for example, technology that allows for them to surveil and monitor various citizens abroad and at home. For example, famously, Pegasus, which is a software produced by a company in Israel that is composed of a number of ex-intelligence officers. The Pegasus software can be downloaded onto people's phones without them ever clicking on anything, and it can essentially give access to the entirety of somebody's phone's data, communications, etc., to whoever has downloaded it on there. And we know for a fact that Khashoggi and his friends had Pegasus downloaded onto their phones. Pegasus is produced in Israel, and despite the fact that it's supposedly produced by a private company, I would very much doubt that such a software would be produced and sold without the complete and utter approval of the Israeli security establishment. So these kinds of softwares have been sold for a long time before Abraham Accords. Even ironically, facial recognition software, which is so central to the policing inside the countries in these places, is actually bought from Israel. There's a very famous instance where when in 2010, Israeli agents assassinated a Hamas leader in United Arab Emirates. Mahmoud al-Mabhouh was assassinated in a hotel in the United Arab Emirates. Interestingly, the 26 Mossad agents who were dual citizens of Israel and another country, were all recognized using a facial recognition software that Israel itself had sold to the UAE. So there is a long history of this kind of technological exchange. Now, one of the things that I want to mention, and I'm going to end on that, is that it is really important to recognize why these kinds of normalizations happen. Why does the coexistence, indeed the survival of the apartheid regime in Israel and the survival of these incredibly repressive and exploitative regimes in the Gulf are codependent? Why is it that the normalization of these relationships is central to the American agenda in the region? And Biden has continued to tout this, and Mohammad bin Salman has, in fact, just as recently as a couple of days ago, confirmed that normalization is not off the table, that in fact it is still being considered by Saudi Arabia. There are a number of different reasons why the countries in the Gulf might want to have a relationship with Israel and normalize the relationship. The first and foremost among these is, of course, the fact that they are ultimately major clients of the United States, despite the fact that, of course, as major clients, they nevertheless sometimes act in ways that doesn't necessarily conform to the demands of the United States. Russia, as well as all the Gulf countries, for example, maintained a relationship with Putin's Russia, despite the fact that they were pressured not to do so. Nevertheless, they are all agents, in some senses, clients, and regional strategic extensions and gendarmes for the United States in the region. This means not only in the Middle East itself, but also very importantly in the Red Sea region, in the Eastern Mediterranean, and in East Africa. And part of the reason that the United States would like to see a continued influence for example, the United Arab Emirates, which American military officers called the Little Sparta, or Saudi Arabia, or Israel, is because of great sort of power competitions and the ways in which these regional powers can guarantee the US a foot in the region. That's the first. The second reason is because of the intelligence collaboration between these different states. The fact of the matter is that we know that, for example, ever since the Camp David Accords, which brought Egypt into Israel's orbit and established a friendship between them, Israel and Egypt have had major intelligence collaboration. In fact, we know that Egypt warned the government of Israel about the impending pending Hamas attack, and they were ignored. And so I think it's that this intelligence cooperation is incredibly important. And as Madawi mentioned, part of the reason for this intelligence cooperation is not because these countries, Saudi Arabia or the Emirates, are trying to defend their own borders. It is because that kind of an intelligence work is necessary for the suppression of their own populations. So strategic control in the region. Second, intelligence. The third element is, of course, oil and gas exploration. I think this is really important to mention, in part because the United Arab Emirates, for example, is one of the largest investors in the various gas exploration programs that Chevron is running in Eastern Mediterranean with Israel. A few days after the 7th of October, a couple of days after the 7th of October, Israel asked Chevron to cease production of oil from the Tamar gas fields, which are off the coast of Palestine. The Tamar gas fields provide the vast majority of Israel's energy needs. And in addition to Chevron, the second or third largest investor in those gas fields is United Arab Emirates Mubadala Energy. As Saudi Arabia, like the United Arab Emirates, is trying to expand its actually oil and gas portfolio by, for example, setting up refineries and petrochemical and plastics industries elsewhere. Having Israel there and the natural gas there is quite important. And given the sort of the experience, the long-standing experience of the Gulf countries in oil and gas exploration, export, and production, that kind of a relationship is useful to both sides. My own area of research is on shipping and transportation, and we know that there is all sorts of collaboration going on between the government of Israel and the various Gulf countries, and particularly Dubai, which has the fourth largest port management company in the world, which has one of the top 10 or 11 ports in the world in terms of transit of goods. And that connection between Israel and the United Arab Emirates, and specifically Dubai, but also Abu Dhabi's port, can guarantee a kind of a network of transportation across the region, which again benefits both, and which will allow for both of them to expand into subsidiary regions in South Asia and East Africa. Now, this is one of those places where actually pressure from inside the UK could be quite useful. We have seen quite a lot of activism around the shipment of arms to Saudi Arabia and to Israel in ports like Barcelona and Genoa in Italy. We perhaps need to see if there is a possibility of organizing such activity and activism here in the ports in the United Kingdom, because huge volumes of actually armament and other kinds of deadly technology leave from this country to go to both Israel and the Gulf. Finally, the last, and I think that in some ways quite significant and will be into the future, relationship that connects Israel, that sort of serves as the basis of the relationship between Israel and the Gulf countries, is exchange of technology. I've already talked about surveillance technology, but I think it's really also important to note agricultural technology is also quite significant. And one of the very interesting things that we see is that the question of food security is emerging in a lot of the discourse of the countries in the Gulf. And where they're talking about food security, what they in essence mean is establishment of industrial agriculture in a lot of different parts of the world. In Arizona for Saudi Arabia, for example, but also, and particularly in East Africa, where huge tracts of land in places like Ethiopia or Sudan are being bought up by Saudi Arabia and by the United Arab Emirates and some of the other Gulf countries in order to produce agriculturally for the food needs of the countries of the Gulf. Now, what this translates into is actually interference by the governments of Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates in East Africa. So what you see is that the normalization ends up actually resulting in massive destabilization of actually the entire peripheral region, as Madawi was talking about. For example, we know for a fact that both the Israelis and the United Arab Emirates have been supporting the RSF, who were accused of all sorts of genocidal violence in Darfur, and who are now engaged in an extremely violent civil war. We know that RSF is being supported by both Israel and the United Arab Emirates. We know that Khalifa Haftar in Libya, now this doesn't have to do with food security, it does have to do with Mediterranean oil and gas hegemony. Khalifa Haftar is being also similarly supported by the United Arab Emirates and is receiving intelligence sort of has established intelligence connections with Israel. So what we see is that the connections, the normalization between these countries is not just about Middle East. It is about these forms of destabilization, forms of hegemony across the whole of the region. I'm going to stop at that point, and I'm happy to answer any questions if anybody wants to type them in the chat. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Arlette, and really useful to get that connection, with what's happening right now in Gaza, especially. You talked about pressure from inside Britain, and we've heard from some expert academic voices from the region with links to the region. We're now going to hear from a few speakers who are based here, involved in different organisations campaigning on this. And the first one is the convener of our organisation, Stop the War Coalition, and leading voice in the British anti-war movement, Lindsey German. Lindsey, over to you.
Thanks very much, Shelley, and very good to be here. I've been involved all day and yesterday in meetings with the police and various other people in London about whether or not this demonstration on Saturday in support of the Palestinians is allowed to go ahead. And I'm very pleased. I know you'll all be pleased to know that despite the best attempts of Suella Braverman and then today Rishi Sunak, the demonstration is going to go ahead. I think it is going to be by far the biggest demonstration over Palestine that we have seen in this country, apart from the big 2003 demonstration over the Iraq War, which also had a slogan over Palestine. But this will be the first on Palestine itself, which will be, I don't know, more than 500,000, maybe 750,000, maybe even bigger. And I think it's important to start with this from my contribution, partly because it's what I've been doing for the last few days, but more importantly, because I think this whole question of freedom and democracy, which we're lectured about so much from the British government, that we're all in favour of democracy, that we can't be against anybody who might be a critic of the British government which isn't a democratic state, is regarded as sort of beyond the pale. But of course, what we're finding is that when it comes to exerting our freedoms and democratic rights, that we find that the government's record on this actually is increasingly repressive, is increasingly trying to stop people doing things. They tried to say people couldn't wave Palestine flags, and we've all seen how well that succeeded on the streets of London and other cities around the country. They tried to say people couldn't chant from the river to the sea, and we've seen how well that succeeded as well. And they've tried, when they couldn't do anything else, these demonstrations get bigger and bigger, they try to cancel them. They try to deny the right to even get on the street. So it's a very important victory for us, I think. And the reason I want to bring it in at the beginning is because, of course, the connection with the British government's delightfully close relationship with the Saudi regime. So objections to undemocratic methods and to autocratic rule are really put on one side when you talk about the relationship between the British government and the Saudis and the upcoming visit of Mohammed bin Salman, which we know will be a grand fated affair. We know there'll be red carpets. We know there'll be limousines taking them everywhere. We know that they'll be meeting people at the highest level of state. We know all these things. And we know none of that is new with Saudi Arabia, that the connection between the British royal family and the connection between successive governments and the Saudis is very, very close. And we know, of course, that is to do with, among other things, it's to do with the wealth and influence of Saudi Arabia itself, but it's also to do with the huge, very, very close connection with British arms sales to Saudi Arabia, the connection between British aerospace and Saudi Arabia, and so on. So I think this is important because it symbolises the absolutely hideous and corrupt relationship at the centre of British government and the British political establishment. That and you see this in the most appalling way, that the various human rights abuses by Saudi Arabia are ignored, excused, or just not talked about and brushed under the carpet all the time. So I think it's very important to have this this meeting, and it's very, very important that we do mobilize for the visit of Mohammed bin Salman whenever that does occur. And you know, there are many reasons for doing so, and I'm sure people have their own particular reason. This is one of the least democratic countries in the world. It's a country where bin Salman himself was directly involved in the murder of Jamal Khashoggi and the dismemberment of his body in one of the most gross and hideous acts of terror, is the only way you can really describe it, which of course caused some embarrassment to the British government, but that is really all that it caused, and that's all been, they hope, moved on. Last year in Saudi Arabia, nearly 200 people were executed, one of the worst records anywhere in the world. And this gives you some idea about the notion of freedom and democracy and civil liberties and all the other things that they talk about. We know when we talk about the war on Yemen, one of the most brutal wars, and we have seen so many brutal wars in the last 20, 30 years, but one of the most brutal wars of anywhere in the world, a war which has had huge civilian casualties through bombing, intensive bombing, facilitated by the British government and the Royal Air Force, which helped to advise the Saudis as how to best to carry out the bombing of civilians and all the other atrocities that took place. So there's all these things that we can talk about, and then there are the relationships of Saudi Arabia with the other countries of the region. I missed the beginning of the previous speaker, but the whole question of Saudi's relationship with the rest of the region is obviously a very, very central one, and is one that we have to have a serious interrogation of. And it seems to me that when you look at this, you've seen in the last 20 years or so the transformation of relationships in the Middle East as a result of the war on terror. You've had the war in Iraq, you had the war in Libya, the bombing of Libya, regime change in Libya. You've had the ongoing war in Syria, and still the continuing legacy of the Iraq war and the occupation there. And all of those, you look at the role of Saudi Arabia in all of those conflicts, and it's played a reactionary role, and a role which makes it a very close ally of the United States and of Britain. And of the particular situation that we're mainly concerned with now, I'm sure, as I started my contribution, the question of the Palestinians and this absolutely criminal bombardment of Gaza by the Israeli Air Force. And I read today that the bunker busting bombs that the Israelis are using to try and get into the tunnels in Gaza are very heavy, and therefore they create huge numbers of civilian casualties. As we've seen, over 10,000 people have died since this bombardment began. So the Americans are trying to find a lighter bomb, so you can still bomb as many people as you have up to now, but without as many civilian casualties. I'm sure that'll make the people of Gaza feel very, very happy about their future. And if you look at the whole question of the normalization of relations, which has already been referred to, the normalization with Israel, this was part of the Abraham Accords when Donald Trump decided that he was going to reshape the Middle East in terms of establishing these normal relations with all the regimes, which of course don't represent their people, don't speak for their people in any serious or democratic way. He thought he was going to do this. The last big prize was the normalization with Saudi Arabia. That obviously is not going to happen now because of what is happening in Gaza and, of course, what is happening in the West Bank as well, where you've really got a second Nakba taking place now in Palestine, where people are being driven from their homes in Gaza, but also driven from their homes by illegal settlements and the most horrendous violence from the IDF and from the settlers in the West Bank. So, what was that normalization about? Of course, it was, as ever, it was about weapons and militarism, and it was about Saudi would get a civilian nuclear program and would get a formal defense pact with the United States, which is immensely useful in its role of continuing to repress its own population and neighboring populations. I think what's very encouraging for us is not only the great solidarity movement that we've seen around the world in support of the Palestinians, in support of what the people of Gaza are suffering, but it's also, I think, increasingly showing people what an apartheid state Israel is, but also how the whole region is based on very much the interests of US imperialism and the other Western imperialism. So it seems to me that it's very important that we do protest over Mohammed bin Salman coming to Britain, but also that we link these issues up. These aren't separate issues. There's not a question for the Palestinians which doesn't also affect all the other regimes in the region. And it's clear that one of the things that the rulers in places like Jordan and Egypt are frightened about is that their own people, their own populations are absolutely at boiling point over the question of what is happening to the Palestinians and what is happening daily to them, the number of deaths, the ethnic cleansing, the terrible things that are going on. So it seems to me this can open up a new development, a new series of developments in the Middle East, which is much more favorable to democracy, which is much more favorable to equality and justice for everybody, including for the Palestinians. And it seems to me that we need to link these issues together. They're very, very closely connected. And that's why we have to be on the streets, as I'm sure we all will be, wherever we are in this coming weekend, but also that we have to be on the streets to say to the Saudis that you may feel that the British government has a very close relationship with you. It does have a close relationship with you, but that does not reflect the opinion of the British people. Thanks very much.
Thanks very much, Lindsey. Absolutely. And do keep an eye out on the Stop the War mailing list for when that is going to be happening. We don't know the exact date of when Mohammed bin Salman's going to be visiting London, but we will be mobilising when it happens. So just keep an eye on that and join us when the time comes. Our next speaker works for the Bertrand Russell Peace Foundation, but he joins us in his capacity as chair nationally of the Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament. Really pleased that you can join us, Tom Unterreiner.
Thanks very much. Thanks to all the previous speakers who have been both informative, very inspirational, and have given us lots of information about what is happening in Saudi Arabia, how it links to the wide Middle East, and again, how that translates back to British politics. But I want to pick on something that Lindsey mentioned, and that's the necessity for us to link all of these issues together and all of the issues that will be presented here today together. I'm based in Nottingham. We've had a series of huge mobilisations, both for the series of national demonstrations and locally in opposition to Israel's murderous onslaught in Gaza and its attacks on Palestinians in the West Bank, and in terms of demanding an immediate ceasefire in the region. Now, I'm just being joined by my 3-year-old. Out you go, Max. Now, it is absolutely disgraceful, yes, what the Israeli government is doing in terms of their murderous onslaught on Gaza, but it's also absolutely disgraceful that our government and the government of their allied states within the nuclear-armed NATO alliance are also refusing to call for a ceasefire. And that's why this Saturday's demonstration is all the more important, and why these mobilisations that have happened across the country and which will be happening in London again this Saturday, are absolutely vital. Now, the issue of what is happening in Palestine, the issue of what is happening in Gaza, the way that the Israeli state behaves, the way that the Saudi government and royal family behaves, and Britain's relationship to all of this is exemplary of a double standards policy. I'm just going to take this young person out of the room.
No worries, Tom. It's good to start them young.
Maxie, you stay there. Is exemplary of a double standards policy which extends across the remit of Britain's approach to foreign affairs. Now, the United Kingdom's relations with Saudi Arabia are based, as we know, on oil, war, and the struggle for global influence. And we know that with all of these things, any talk of a rules-based order, international law, rights, and democracy are just thrown out of the window. Now, it's almost as if our rulers never actually believed in any of these things in the first place. Sorry again. Anna? I think you might have to go to another speaker and I'll come back.
That's okay, Tom. You do what you need to do.
Okay.
Do what you need to do. And it will be my pleasure to bring in our next speaker, who is Advocacy Manager at the Campaign Against the Arms Trade. She's previously worked for the Irish Foreign Ministry and reported to Sans Frontières. So Katie Fallon, really great to have you, Katie, and perhaps we'll bring Tom in a little bit at the end again if he's sorted Maxie out, and somebody in the chat says that he's practicing his civil disobedience. He's obviously being brought up well to be disruptive. Katie, if you're there, I'll bring you in.
Yeah, absolutely. And I have to say it was lovely to see Max's smiling face there. So I think yeah, thanks Tom for introducing us all. So my name is Katie Fallon. I'm Advocacy Manager at Campaign Against Arms Trade. Campaign Against Arms Trade campaigns against the UK arms trade specifically, and our vision is a world without arms exports. We focus on where the most problematic places where arms exports are being used, where they undermine democracy and where they're used in contravention of international law. So just before I begin, and like a number of the other, I think all of the other speakers, I just want to express my solidarity with the people of Gaza and with all Palestinians. You know, our governments are the UK, the US, many Western governments, and also the EU has only added to this, like the EU leadership. They're making this possible, and they're making us all complicit in this. And we just have a moral duty to keep working until we see a ceasefire. It's, you know, from the word go has immediately been, I suppose we were informed in advance that we were going to see war crimes and the threat of genocide. You know, words like elimination, vengeance, revenge were being thrown about by the Israeli government, and now that within a month we have basically seen all that come to pass. And while this is, you know, so horrifying and so depressing, we just don't have room to be able to not act. Yeah, I hope everyone, because I know you hear, like, so yeah, I just wanted to say from the start, like he was saying, you know, I've been finding it so frustrating, and I would also say heartbreaking, that anything that, you know, working with CATS materials, with things that I'm writing on now, sometimes there are things that I can copy and paste word for word because they apply exactly the same. All of the kind of you know, like obviously the what civilians were experiencing in Yemen from the very beginning was horrendous, and you know, we've kind of taken 2 legal cases against the government. Those have produced 2 judgments from the court, and you know, kind of I've done a bit of analysis on the most recent one, and everything that we've said, you know, there's impunity for crimes against civilians. There's no real willingness to reduce the horrors that civilians experience, and even, you know, I mean, it's good to talk about civilians, but like, you know, huge numbers of deaths is no good thing. And we can, you know, IHL, international humanitarian law, or even war crimes, those are like the absolute worst case scenarios. Those should not be the bar for conflict. Like, we should be asking for more. We should be asking, I mean, we are, but already it's been kind of bent out of shape so far, the concept of IHL, that it's in tatters basically at the moment. I think to speak about war crimes or to speak about international humanitarian law in this context almost feels absurd at this point, because of how it's being treated by Western governments. So that is kind of, I kind of jumped into some of the points that I wanted to get to as I go down, but that's basically kind of where I'm coming from. So the last time that Mohammed bin Salman visited London in March 2018, it was just 7 months before Jamal Khashoggi was brutally assassinated in the Saudi consulate in Istanbul, which was on the 2nd of October 2018. So we've just gone past the 5-year anniversary. At that same time in 2018, 8,272 civilians had already been killed by the Saudi-led coalition, armed by a number of Western states, and including the UK and the US. Today, the number of civilians that died in coalition airstrikes is 8,983. And the people of Yemen have received no justice for these crimes that have been committed against them. At this, you know, in March 2022, we saw 81 people were killed in the largest mass execution in modern Saudi history. And only 4 days later, the former Prime Minister, thankfully now former Boris Johnson, visited MBS in Riyadh. So I think all of these speak to what Madawi was saying earlier, that this idea of engagement is actually, there is the engagement to kind of improve the Saudis' domestic and international human rights record is actually just impunity. And this is being replicated again with what we see in Israel. We have relationships that are described as allies, but actually they're, you know, like, I think we all know I think it's really important sometimes to compare political relationships with normal human personal relationships. A real friend or a real ally is someone that you can be honest with, someone that will listen to you, someone that is not just expecting platitudes all of the time. This is not what we ask of our friends. It's not what we ask of our, you know, our teachers, our leaders, people we look up to. We want to be held accountable so that we can continue to grow as people. So when, you know, governments describe somebody as an ally, but they can't say anything against them, this is, you know, inherently doesn't make sense to us as people. And so it doesn't make sense politically if it doesn't make sense humanly. As well as these crimes that I've just outlined, in 2021, Salman al-Shahab, a Saudi student who was at Leeds University, returned home for a holiday, and she was sentenced to 34 years in prison for having a Twitter account following and retweeting dissidents and activists. She was 34 years old at the time, so that was another kind of horrible joke, and she is still imprisoned. So all of these crimes are serious human rights violations, are despicable. But, you know, there's a second crime basically behind all of these, and this is the crime of complicity and support, and some by our own governments. And sometimes I nearly find myself using the word silence, but, you know, silence is not what we're looking at here. It's support and complicity. Our government have not remained ignorant of these human rights abuses, but they have failed to tackle them by continuously rolling out the red carpet for MBS, regardless of what he or the Saudi regime has done externally or internally to their own population. And I think, you know, while it's really important to be highly critical of the Saudi regime, it's also, I think, you know, in this context, like, I'm constantly inspired by Saudi activists in the UK and those working in Saudi who are not only themselves at such risk, but also their families, which just kind of puts a completely different context on their activism. So, you know, it's like, if you ever needed to see the proof that the regime doesn't represent the people, like, they are living proof. Yeah, and I think, you know, you can buy football teams and you can buy golfing tournaments, but there is no substitute for freedom and for justice and for peace. The arms trade on the arms export side of things. So part of that is our research. We estimate that the UK has sold at least 25 billion to the coalition since the war began, and that is slightly higher. UK-made fighter jets, bombs, and missiles played a central role in attacks by the coalition. As I mentioned before, 8,983 civilians have been killed in attacks by the coalition. And these, as has been said by other speakers, they've targeted homes, farms, schools, hospitals, weddings, and funerals. So all of that puts this, they're clear examples of violations of IHL. And these, from the very outset of this war, there was outcry from local and international NGOs, so Yemeni organizations on the ground, international organizations and humanitarian organizations. You know, for instance, Oxfam's UK DFID funded water projects were bombed by the coalition, which was armed by the UK. This kind of absurd reality. And UN bodies also warned that these coalition attacks appeared to be in violation of international humanitarian law. I won't go into all of these details, but just some of the examples that we referenced in our legal cases, and this is from the last one in January 21. These included the airstrike on the civilian funeral in the Great Hall on the 8th of October 2016. 132 civilians were killed in that. There was an attack on the Dahamar prison, 31st of August 2019, that killed 100. Another attack in a residential area in February 2020, 32 people were killed. And each of these person is a family member that's been lost. There's a loss that reverberates through the community, and there has been no even attempt to financially I can't even use the word, there's no financial compensation for this, but the humanitarian situation in Yemen is still dire. And, you know, the Western countries that backed this conflict, that armed it, have now kind of turned around and washed their hands of it and are happy to take absolutely no accountability, legally or otherwise, to provide these people with justice. So just let me know as well if I'm going over time. I won't go on for too much longer, but I just wanted to touch on
a minute or two, Katie.
Okay, great. Just wanted to touch before I finish on our legal cases. So we were successful in 2019 with a judicial review, which forced the government to stop issuing new licenses to Saudi based on the fact that the court found it was unlawful how they were making assessments around the likelihood of war crimes. And then the government said they did a review and actually it's all fine. These were just isolated incidents. So we challenged them again in January of this year. Nearly the year is over, and unfortunately we weren't successful. And I just wanted to highlight before I finish a couple of the things in that judgment from June 2023 that were really concerning and are very much mirrored in what's happening in Gaza now. So one thing was that the word margin appeared 5 times in the judgment, and it referenced a 2020 paper, in the judgment, and this referenced a paper from government where it said that the details of possible breaches are consistent with a limited number of errors and well within the margin that would be expected of a conflict of this nature. But this margin that they're speaking about is people's lives being ended. And the idea that there's this margin for war crimes or IHL breaches is not something that exists, you know, in the Geneva Convention. It's not this limitless margin. And now what we're seeing in Gaza is that there is no limit for when it's of the geopolitical when you want to secure your hegemony, basically, which is what has been going on for a really long time. I think that to describe people's lives as a margin of error is disgusting, and it's something that we really want to advocate on this. We already wanted to advocate on this point, so that to then see a new bombardment where these dynamics are being actualized and realized in the worst possible way is just extremely frustrating. Doesn't cover it, but I hope I'm glad to have the opportunity to make more people aware that there's long-standing dynamics that have allowed what's happened in Yemen to be now replicated in Gaza, and it's this kind of dehumanization. It's putting self-interest above everything else. And we as people we have influence over our governments, and until we see ceasefires, until we see justice, we can't stop raising our voices for change. So yeah, I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Katie. Really good to have those kind of statistics as well on the work that you guys do. Really grateful. contribution. Tom, or Tom and/or Max, do you want to come back in again on any points that you weren't able to make last time?
Yeah. Yeah. Is it okay for me to make my contribution now? Is that okay?
Please, yeah. Go ahead.
Okay. As any of you who have ever looked after small children know, one of the joys of it is that you get a daily lesson on how to defy unreasonable suggestions. And I think, talking of defying unreasonable suggestions, it's absolutely fantastic that we're going to have this massive demonstration on Saturday in solidarity with the people of Gaza, the Palestinians more widely, and calling for a ceasefire, an immediate ceasefire. Look, as we've heard from a series of expert speakers and outstanding activists, bin Salman's visit to the UK is just one part of a wider normalization process. And this word normalization sort of sticks in my throat, really, because there's nothing normal about it. There is nothing normal or acceptable about it. And this process is being spearheaded by the United States. And the process has seen the Crown Prince feted and coddled by everybody, from Joe Biden to the awful British Foreign Secretary, James Cleverly. Now, I believe that this process is partly just for show. As we know, the disturbing record of bin Salman himself and the appalling reality of Saudi Arabia's conduct in Yemen and more widely has not stopped an enormous trade in oil and weapons. But there's a more substantial dimension to the red carpet treatment being offered to bin Salman, one that illustrates the lengths to which the US, Britain, and allied states will go to in order to influence events in the Middle East. And this is related to Britain's special role in all of this, or something particular about Britain, which goes from a series of military installations in the country itself, some which host United States military personnel, others which act as landing strips for United States bombers and the United States Air Force, all the way through to a series of commercial operations across the country, which constitute a complex network of militarism, imperialism, and a threat to the Middle East and to the wider world. One of the more obscure elements of this network is the Warton Aerodrome, which is just outside of a village in Lancashire. It's a very small place. The nearest town or city of any population is Preston. This is a private airfield owned and operated by BAE Systems. And this airfield is next to a major assembly and testing facility for this weapons manufacturer. Now, at this obscure location in the northwest of England, 30 Saudi pilots have learnt to fly the Hawk fighter jet between 2018 and 2021 in preparation for flying BAE's more advanced and more deadly Tornado and Typhoon aircraft. So when you see these arms fairs and these arms shows, when you see organizations and multinational companies like BAE Systems telling everybody that their systems, that their products, that their machines of death have been battle tested, what they're talking about is that they're trying to flog this equipment, flog these weapons that have been battle tested on the people of Yemen, the people of Gaza, and wherever else it is that Britain, its allies, and the states like Saudi Arabia that it supports are engaged in warfare. According to a 2021 report by Matt Kennard and Phil Miller on the Declassified website, a flight leaves Warton from the Warton airfield every Wednesday, headed for the King Fahd military air base in Saudi Arabia. Of course, BAE doesn't tell anybody what's on these aeroplanes. It doesn't say specifically what type of murder equipment it's sending to Saudi Arabia, but it's strongly believed that these flights carry parts of the Saudi Typhoon fleet. Now, when these planes, chartered from a private company, leave British airspace, that's not the end of Britain's involvement in these flights and in these arms supplies, because en route to the King Fahd air base, these planes land at RAF Akrotiri, which is an RAF base in Cyprus. They land there to refuel and they stay overnight. They take off again. They fly to the King Fahd military airbase, and the parts are used to ensure that Saudi can continue its murderous campaign against Yemen. It is worth asking, in the context of the events which are posed more sharply at the moment, exactly what role this airbase plays in Israel's war against the Palestinians, because Britain has ships and aircraft in the region. Where are these aircraft, these surveillance aircraft, flying from? What role are they playing? What role does this British airbase on Cyprus play? And what role do the other British bases, including the monitoring and the spy bases on Cyprus, play in Israel's war against the Palestinians and the people of Gaza? Britain, to repeat, can be understood in this context as a whole network of military and commercial military bases intent on projecting British and Western power and influence across the planet. And we can see that very clearly in terms of Britain's relationship with the Saudi regime and BAE's murderous commercial relationship with Saudi Arabia. Now, Saudi, I'm speaking as representative of the Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament, so it's worth noting that Saudi Arabia is a non-nuclear state. As far as we know, it does not have a nuclear weapons program. Indeed, unlike the United Kingdom and a number of other countries, Saudi Arabia has signed, but not ratified, the United Nations Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. Saudi Arabia is also an advocate for a Middle East nuclear weapons-free zone. Again, all in the contrast to the West's main ally in the region, Israel, which is not only a nuclear-armed state, but one which refuses to acknowledge the fact and refuses to sign up to even the most basic nuclear treaties, like the Non-Proliferation Treaty. This is not the end of the story as far as Saudi Arabia goes, because Saudi Arabia is very interested, as we've heard already, in developing a nuclear energy program. And it's playing this interest out in a number of directions. For instance, Saudi Arabia has courted Chinese interest and advice over the construction of nuclear power plants. But also Saudi Arabia has demanded, as part of this normalization process, a deal with the United States over nuclear technology and nuclear power generation. And the US is very keen on this sort of thing. They have a whole program called Atoms for Peace, would you believe, to facilitate such deals. However, Saudi Arabia is not prepared to enter into and to agree to the sorts of constraints and the sorts of restrictions that generally go with these Atoms for Peace programs, that generally go with nuclear agreements with the United States. Saudi Arabia does not want any of the stringent anti-proliferation restrictions that usually accompany such arrangements. Now, this means that Saudi Arabia does not want to commit to the promise not to spread or develop these nuclear technologies further. What does this imply? It implies that Saudi Arabia would not welcome close scrutiny in what it does with any nuclear technologies transferred to it. Now, this should trouble us all because Saudi spokespeople have repeatedly, military spokespeople, have repeatedly spoken of military options for nuclear technology, despite the stated commitments of the kingdom. It should also trouble us because bin Salman himself has openly spoken of seeking nuclear weapons if, to quote, Iran develops one. Now, developing nuclear weapons and delivery systems is no easy matter. Britain itself, for example, is incapable of maintaining what the government calls an independent nuclear capability without significant assistance from the United States. Also, it's not like Saudi Arabia will be able to magic such a weapon out of thin air the day after, to quote again, Iran develops one. Leaving aside for a second the likelihood or not of Iran ever developing such a weapon, what bin Salman and the Saudi regime implies with this warning and the conditions embedded in Normalization is that Saudi Arabia would very much like to commence a nuclear weapons program. Now, the Middle East already has one nuclear armed state that shows merciless disregard for humanity and which is currently waging mass murder. That country is Israel. The region could certainly do without another such state. Now, for its part, Iran, despite the rantings of Netanyahu at the United Nations and elsewhere, was nowhere close to developing a nuclear weapon at the point where Trump destroyed the Iran deal, the JCPOA. The International Atomic Energy Agency, which was all over Iran at the time, but which has never set foot in Israel, it's worth repeating. Their reports are there for all to see. They confirmed again and again and again that this was not on the agenda. There is currently no evidence that Iran is on the verge of enriching nuclear materials needed for nuclear weapons. Indeed, Iran is very keen for something similar to the Iran deal or the JCPOA to become operational again. So why is bin Salman employing the same nuclear scare tactics used by Netanyahu over Iran? Why? What's the parallel? Because they know, as we do, that the billions and billions of arms sales, the diplomatic cover, the blind eyes turned to mass repression, and the support given to murderous wars of conquest conducted by Israel and Saudi Arabia from the rest, West, Britain included, are about regional power, the global shifts in power, dominance over an oil-producing region, and profiteering from misery. Now, this is why the British government will welcome bin Salman with open arms, and it's why we say bin Salman is not welcome here. Thanks a lot.
Thanks so much for that, Tom. Great to have you with us, and great that you could come back as well and finish that contribution. Thank you to all the speakers tonight and for everybody who's joined us. I just want to draw attention to Ian's comment in the chat. He's posted a link to the declassified film, which was mentioned. And I also want to just draw your attention to the fact that we did a webinar talking about that film with Matt from Declassified. We also had Ahmed El Batati, who was a British soldier who left post, resigned